Don Braid says, I'm hearing it's likely Kenney will stay on as leader and premier until a new leadership election in which he may run. Voting in UCP caucus has apparently
No!
begun.
You piece of shit. Oh my god.
In which he may run.
Yeah. So he's going to do the Joe Clark thing, but with 20% even less support.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's Jacob Kenney from Speech from the Throne here with a supplemental episode 11.5 discussing the sudden resignation of Jason Kenney as leader of the United Conservative Party of Alberta and potentially, but not yet confirmed, as premier of the province of Alberta. Yes, somehow, in the midst of a provincial election of my adopted home of Ontario, it's my hometown Alberta that still keeps calling back with the more interesting politics. Now, Jason Kenney had stated for months that he was looking to stay even if he won a slim majority. He kept saying that 50% plus one was all he needed. Yet, last night, in a leadership review, he received 17.6 thousand votes to 16.6 thousand votes, 51.4% of votes cast, and that was not enough for him. He withdrew as leader of the United Conservative Party. So why was he willing to do that? Well, Liam McPherson is here with me to discuss that, and that's the first thing we'll talk about. Why was it that he felt he had to step down, even though he did narrowly surpass the threshold he had set beforehand? And next, we've been hearing very often in the last few hours these bizarre hot takes where columnists are coming out of the woodworks claiming that, although they've spent months, maybe even years attacking Jason Kenney, they secretly had a crush on the guy. That they think that, this is a terrible, terrible man, of course, but what's going to happen is even worse. He was holding back the true lunatics, and we should be proud at Jason Kenney's incredible organizing abilities to hold his party together. I'm going to fight back against that. I think an important and necessary debate is coming for the United Conservative Party, a debate that conservatives across the country need to pay attention to. And finally, in the final segment of this quick reaction podcast, we'll discuss what that debate should look like and the ways we as progressives hope that debate in the future of the United Conservative Party can move forward. So that's the opening spiel. Liam, let's start with the beginning. Jason Kenney said that he was only going to step down if he was defeated, if he lost 50% of review votes. He changed the leadership rules a few times in his favor so that he could get over that 50% mark, and yet he still stepped down with 51%. Why is it, in your opinion, that he was willing to remove himself from the equation?
Well, the question is he willing to remove himself from the equation? Because I've been following the reporting from Don Braid at the Calgary Herald very closely. I've been looking at his Twitter account, checking it all day. And as of recording, which is 7:46 Atlantic on May the 19th, that's when we're recording this. About an hour ago, there was reports from Don Braid about a caucus meeting that Jason Kenney's UCP, United Conservative Party, is having to talk about whether he resigns immediately and they replace him at that caucus meeting, or whether they decide to let him stay on until a leadership election can be organized. And apparently, according to Don Braid, he is floating the idea of running in the leadership contest. This is a man that will just not, and I don't mean literally here, folks, but this is a man that will just not die and move on. And, he could have a lucrative career in the in the private
millions.
sector. He could make millions in the oil industry if he wanted to get into that, in consulting, anything that he probably put his mind to. He's a smart mind, but not when it comes to knowing when to quit. I was actually quite surprised when I found out last night that he was intending to resign. I thought that was shocking. I thought he would try to barrel through, as he always insisted he would if he got more than 50% of the vote. However, maybe he thinks he's being strategically clever by waiting and potentially entering the leadership contest. I don't think that's clever at all. He's got a record low approval rating. Everybody wants to be rid of this guy, whether they're further to the right, whether they're further to the left. Everybody's tired of this guy. And I don't conceivably see how he manages to do anything but embarrass himself in a leadership
But you
contest.
think he would have announced that the night of? Like, why did he let Jason Kenney resign be the headline? You think if he was going to resign and then run in the leadership election, he should have said that the night of, so that becomes a story leading out of the night. Like, it seems like bad political decision making if he's going to hit us with that surprise blow.
This well, I got that, but like it's like like it just adds another dimension to what we're going to talk about today if he decides to stay on.
Yeah, my personal opinion is that when he was saying he only needed 50% plus one, Kenney was imagining a different scenario. He was imagining him getting 70%. He was imagining him getting 80%, a number that any other self-respecting leader would still take as a condemnation of his conduct and choose to resign, but a number that at least has the veneer of legitimacy, that gives him a fighting chance. And, when we say his 51.4%, it sounds like a majority of the party. But the rebels in his party have also made accusations that he bought thousands of votes. There were 4,000 memberships that the rebels claim were purchased with only 6 credit cards. They made they made a formal complaint to the Alberta Elections Commission, and the Alberta Elections Commission is investigating. So if Jason Kenney won by only 1,000 votes, less than 1,000 votes, but he was willing to steal 4,000 of them, it's quite possible that Jason Kenney, he knows what he did. He knows the rules he broke. He knows the true numbers. Maybe when he looks at the real math, he realizes he doesn't have 51%. He only has 40%. He only has 30%. He has bent every possible rule. He has all the advantages, and he still can only get 17,000 numbers to appear for him. That's why I think he stepped down. Because, if he had stayed around 51%, there's so many questions as to the legitimacy of that number, the party would have split anyways. The rebels in his caucus would have left. They would have formed a splinter party, and that potentially could have forced a snap election which he was certain to lose. This is the only way that the party can still survive. Potentially with him winning a leadership contest overall, I don't think that could possibly work, but I think more likely is a new force. People are floating Rona Ambrose, people are floating maybe even Stephen Harper, but a new force to come and unite the party. Now, maybe we can talk about that, Lima, whether you think that that's a good idea, or I'll get your reaction to what I just said.
Well, I mean, I have a lot to say on all of it. I mean, this is a guy Jacob and I have followed for 10 years at least. Like, it's been a long time.
Yeah.
More for Jacob, I'm sure, but for me, at least 10 years, at least since he was a cabinet minister in the Harper government. He had a choice. People were wondering, is he going to run for federal conservative leader? Or is he going to go back to his home province? And he chose to go back to his home province. And I think people expected it to be a cakewalk, and at least it was at first. Rachel Notley had been successfully demonized by Jason Kenney and the PCs, which then became the UCP when they merged with the Wild Rose Party. And everybody was expecting it to just be, the big conservative Klein 2.0. That's reference to Ralph Klein, former premier. Big conservative Klein revolution 2.0, basically. And it wasn't. He almost immediately ran into trouble when he would basically... one of his things was reaching into his populist bag of tricks and stoking fears against the LGBTQ community, against racial minorities, against pretty much anybody he could to mine votes from his base. But then, because at his heart Jason Kenney is a relatively serious politician when it comes to governing, I'll give him that. In terms of when it was a pandemic, he decided to. I think his measures were totally inadequate and also hyper partisan because of his base. But he made some effort to do things to the point where his base didn't like it, which wasn't very much. I'm not saying he did a lot, but he did enough that he pissed off his base, and they thought he was doing too much by implementing restrictions. That really hurt his standing within conservative circles. But oddly enough, it's Rachel Notley leaving, I think, Albertans with some sort of buyer's remorse now that they're stuck with Kenney. I think they wish they had stuck with Notley, and maybe Rachel Notley wasn't that bad after all. Maybe Kenney put those ideas in our head and we want her again. It's looking very likely like the 2023 election will be, I don't want to say a coronation for Rachel Notley, but she's looking pretty good. And it's still a year away. Lots can happen. It'll depend on their new leader in large part and how they're able to define Rachel Notley or go that route. But right now you've got millions of extremely unhappy Albertans, both in the UCP base and outside of the base. I was actually having a lot of fun I don't usually like to troll, but there's a UCP, there's like a UCP issues manager or something on Twitter, like complaining about, like, obviously pro Kenney, complaining about like what massive political suicide they just committed by getting rid of Kenney. I'm like, are you well? Like,
he was going to lose anyway.
I think I made a snarky remark or something, got the Duncan, and that's why Twitter's a shithole, because it makes you do stuff like that. But
because of people like you.
But I also don't feel bad about this particular instance. But anyway, so I'm digressing a bit here, but all that to say, it's going to depend a lot on the leader, and it's going to depend a lot on this leader and whether he decides to run in a leadership election. I don't know how he can possibly think that he would have a rat's chance in hell doing that. Now, can the party unite, which is the greater point I want to get to? I think it's getting tougher and tougher for conservative parties across Canada to stay united. And the reason I say that is, we've talked a lot in this podcast about the populist wave that's sweeping over Canada. And part of the consequences of that is, yes, progressive ideas are getting blown up in the public sphere as being wokest, and the term woke has become a very negative thing that can be applied to people, despite the fact that it only means that you just care about other people getting rights. It's become a very negative thing, and that's had dire consequences for progressive ideals in the States and slowly in Canada. However, the other unintended consequence from this wave of right-wing populism that's sweeping the country is the effect it has on conservatives who aren't willing to go along with what Bruce Anderson at Abacus Data calls, the angry machine, the angry channel. And the what he means by the angry channel is basically like there's a large spate of the base in conservative parties right now in Canada that are very angry, and like basically like the way that Bruce Anderson was describing it, and I agree a lot with his analysis on this. And by the way, you can check him out on Twitter. He's on Twitter. He's on Peter Mansbridge's podcast sometimes. He puts out polls through Abacus Data, his polling firm, blah, blah, blah. But he's great. And his take was basically like, conservatives, particularly in Canada, hate Justin Trudeau. That's a given. They hate him. They've always hated him. It's always bordered on a rabid, foaming hate. And the conservatives fundraise off that. They send emails to their... And this is at every level where this sort of approach is applied. So I would say Ontario, I would say Alberta, I would say at the federal level, I would say probably New Brunswick, like conservative administrations that are more right wing. They'll send emails like, "Hey, Jacob, have you heard what Trudeau did? He's threatening our country." And like, you get an email like that every week about how the prime minister's threatening our country and ruining this and ruining that. You're going to hate the man, and you're going to give your money to the conservatives to defeat him. But after a time, especially when the conservative is too moderate, it gets to the point where Trudeau is still there. And they're wondering, why haven't you been able to do anything? We've had 3 elections now. How come we can't beat him? We should lurch further to the right, and you're not going further enough to the right. So therefore, you're not a true conservative. And, it's the game that we're seeing played with Polyev versus Charest. It's the game that we're seeing played with, I guess, in a perverted sense, Kenney, who I wouldn't call a moderate, but he is in his party in some ways. Kenney versus the more Looney Tunes wings of his parties. And he's said in the past, you need, what did he say about the asylum? Was the asylum comment?
To stop the lunatics from running the asylum.
Right. And there's some, even though I think he's kind of a lunatic himself, there's truth to that. And Michelle Rempel-Garner wrote an op-ed for the National Post recently about the Great White Replacement Theory, which is this, and I'm going to get into this because I think it's pertinent here and ties in. The White Replacement Theory is as old as time. It's been around for a long time. Pre-internet, pre-World War, we're talking hundreds of years this theory has been around at least. It's the theory that countries or administrations or governments are trying to bring in or assist massive amounts of non-white immigrants to come into the country with the specific expressed political goal of replacing white people in positions of power and removing their sort of leverage when it comes to their political futures and their social futures. And it's used, usually that's tied in with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about the World Economic Forum and how somehow the Jews are controlling the world. Like, it's just crazy. And The shooter in Buffalo there was crazy into all of that. He was convinced that whites were being replaced, that the Democrats were replacing whites with illegal immigrants who would vote for them, and just horse shit.
And then he drove for 2 hours to find a black community so that he could kill 10 black people.
And again, I'm not saying that I'm not trying to glorify the violence here. I'm just using that to illustrate kind of the more radical parts of right-wing extremism, and it's finding its place in Canada. There were people at the Freedom Convoy who showed up for a day and waved some signs and left, I'm sure. But then there were people, most of which we saw, who chose to remain after the first day, who ran around, and even on the first day, ran around with Nazi swastika symbols and fascist flags, and QAnon. That's QAnon's a fringe conspiracy group on the right, and QAnon signs, and where we go one, we go all is a QAnon slogan, and things about being the Great Replacement theory and the World Economic Forum, and pretty much anything you could think of was on display there from the fringe sort of. And they love being called fringe, they've sort of made that their brand. But the reality is this fringe element, this growing influence of this fringe element in Canada's conservative movement is starting to make people that we thought were too conservative to begin with, like Jean Charest, like Jason Kenney, look like moderates because they can't get control of the lunatics in the asylum, to paraphrase Kenney. And so I don't know. I don't know if somebody's going to be able to unite the UCP, because I wonder if they just have too many crazies. And unless they split back into the PCs and the Wild Rose, it's just never going to be viable for them to be united. That's kind of how I feel.
I think there's a big debate coming, a battle for the soul of the party that is at the heart of conservatism in Alberta. And I think that it's important for conservatives, if they want to stay united, to understand the difference between debates and compromises. A debate is where two sides meet, they hash it out, and then everyone agrees to settle with the winner, that they're all going to follow the winner of the argument, the winner of the war, the winner of the election, the winner of the contest gets to call the shots. A compromise is where two parties meet and they move in the middle. Now, the United Conservative Party is in a position where if they have a debate, they can stay united. If the party is willing to show and give equal platform to all of the craziest ideas, I still hope and believe that if ordinary United Conservative members see how far some of their members have fallen down the rabbit hole, and just to what direction some of the conservatives in their movement want to push that party, that the majority will choose some level of sanity. That's my genuine hope. But if they're stuck in a world of compromises where they need to they think that they need to keep the far right element into the party by throwing them bones, by giving them policy alternatives, they're only going to feed this right wing and move it farther and farther. Because at the end of the day, we're approaching scenarios where there just is no acceptable compromise, where there is nothing that the moderates can give to the far right without losing support on a growing left, a growing progressive movement, even in Alberta, particularly in the cities, in Calgary and Edmonton. If you look at something like lockdowns, you cannot give a concession on lockdowns to the far right. You cannot give a concession on vaccine mandates to the far right, because people in the cities will be afraid for their lives. It's not something where you can move to the middle. And that's ultimately why Kenney was defeated, was because it was impossible to triangulate all of these allegiances. But Alberta conservatives have a history of having these debates behind closed doors and being willing to move in the general pro-business conservative direction, quietly tamping the social conservative side down because they know it scares away money. The PCs did it for 40 years. Ernest Manning did it for 20 years before that. Alberta conservatives have a 60-year history of being able to accomplish this, and I think it's possible. I think that this debate now is going to be nasty. We're going to see the absolute id of this movement. But if someone is able, and it's going to have to be a fresh face. It can't be someone from Ottawa. It can't be another Jim Prentice. It can't be another Brian Jean. It can't be another Jason Kenney. It can't be someone who thinks they're better than the ordinary Albertans and doesn't understand Albertans talk. It's got to be someone that speaks in that radical reactionary language, that anti-woke language, but is still willing to put policies that make sense. That's something that Ralph Klein was able to do. He always spoke like a social conservative. He spoke like he was the most degenerate Albertan you'd ever met in your life. And yet, behind closed doors with businessmen, he was able to shake hands and do deals, and he was able to govern just like any run-of-the-mill conservative you've met. That's the type of personality that's going to bring these factions together. And I hope that if they're willing to have this debate, if the social conservatives, the crazier elements, the lunatics trying to run the asylum, see that they have legitimately lost this debate, hopefully because oil is going back, because jobs are coming back, and because the NDP is such a great threat, they might be willing to go behind someone that feels culturally acceptable, even if he doesn't necessarily give him the red meat that they're going for. That's my hope. That's my hope.
I mean, it's all just one big question mark, isn't it? Like, I mean, right now, we were talking could be last podcast for us. It could be future podcast for the listeners. I'm not sure which is going to come out first, but the last episode we recorded before today was about the Ontario election debate. And, Doug Ford right now is quite a significant figure in Ontario politics. He's managed to sort of, in some sort of way, Bill Davis's way to being trusted by a large number of Ontarians, at least enough to give him a shrug and a vote. Not saying that's a good thing, but he has. Yep. And so, however, like I said, it's a big question mark across the country, and that includes Ontario, where two new fringe right-wing parties have popped up. There's the Ontario Party and New Blue, which was started by former PC MPP Belinda, I don't know how to pronounce her last name. I think it's Caharlios. She was an MPP that was in Doug Ford's caucus, and she was booted because she voted against COVID-19 measures. And so she started one with her husband, and then, because her husband's also an ex-MPP or something. And then, of course, I think it was Derek Sloan that started the other one. It's just like, come on, man.
Yeah, it is Derek Sloan that has the other one.
And they'll I'm not saying they'll show up to Queen's Park with 20 new MPPs. I'm just saying that they, slowly but surely there will be people who will tire of Doug Ford's style of governing, which is, in an Ontario context, similar to Kenney's, in that he isn't really running a fiscally conservative budget. He's spending billions, just not on the right things. But anyway, it's hard. It's getting hard for some fiscal hawks in his caucus to think that he's fiscally conservative. It's getting hard for social conservatives in his caucus to believe he cares about them at all. And that anger is red hot right now. So I wouldn't be surprised if some of those votes, and more of those votes, go the way of the New Blue and Ontario Party. And I think it will become a factor in probably some of the closer races where maybe 2,000 or 3,000 people in a riding vote for this party, like they did for PPC in the federal election, and they never had a shot in hell of winning, but it was just enough taken away from the Tories for the Liberals or someone else to come through. Like, I do think it will make a difference in some riding races, particularly as Doug Ford gets more unpopular. And I think we're going to start seeing this. I mean, Nova Scotia, I'm embarrassed. I don't think there's a PPC copy party here yet. I know that there is in New Brunswick.
New Brunswick that even is older than the PPC.
Yeah, they've been around for a little while, and they've kind of gained notoriety because of the current political climate. But if there isn't one in Nova Scotia, there will be one in Nova Scotia. You're going to see these further right-wing fringe parties popping up in several different provinces. You've got the Quebec Conservative Party that was basically irrelevant before, like a year ago, or even 6 months ago, is now soaring up the polls because a lot of fed up conservatives who don't feel like Legault or Ford or Kenney is conservative enough are looking for places to park their votes. And I think it's almost like I wish I could have said to conservatives, you reap what you sow, so I'll say it now, you reap what you sow, to be honest. Yes, it's an unintended consequence of them stoking populist flame, but it's also a devastating thing for our country as more of these ideas become mainstream.
Yeah, like, I'm not necessarily so certain that if you unleash the fire of populism, you're necessarily going to be burnt by it. I think we have a lot of, particularly in the prairie provinces, a history of populist leaders who've been able to ride it to victory.
Yeah, not everybody gets hurt by it.
Tommy Douglas, I think, is the most classic example of a populist who was able to ride that wave into huge success. And there are lots of you could almost make an argument that every single leader that served more than 2 terms as premier of Alberta or Saskatchewan was in some sense a populist. Like, I think probably just because of where I'm from politically, I'm more willing to accept that part. For me, if a populist party is only nipping at the heels of a larger conservative party, it's a place for the Conservative Party to park its extremists, to park its lunatics, let them air their grievances, yell and scream, and bash a car. But it doesn't really make a huge problem to them electorally. Like the PCs were able to survive in Alberta for several election cycles with the Wild Rose constantly chipping at them. It is a possibility that you can make it work, particularly in Alberta where there's always oil that you can use to bribe your citizens, basically, to keep on the pro-business side. I think that Alberta is probably unique in that scenario, but I do think there is something to be said about having a place for people to vent their reactionary ideas that isn't the main Conservative Party. When you're having these debates inside the true Conservative Party, that's where the discussion becomes a little more dangerous, because they're the ones that can actually implement.
Well, that's why this is so scary, because I think we're seeing sort of 2 approaches where the ideas get mainstreamed and brought in to the normal party policy.
And like white replacement that you said, like that is they were like National Post columnists who were making columns about white replacement theory in 2017. Like it's become mainstream very quickly.
It is, and now, I mean, finally, thank God, maybe it's too late, but finally you've got some MPs. The fact that you've got some MPs standing up against it is great to see. It's great to see Rempel Garner taking responsibility for her role in perpetuating, some of the failures of the 2015 campaign. There were some of the racist promises there. It's great to see her speaking out about the white replacement theory, but it's definitely like, this is a party that is having a civil war. This is the most infighting that we've seen in the conservative movement, maybe in decades. Like it's pretty brutal, and it reminds me of how the Liberals were. It's starting to remind me of how the Liberals were, because there's just so much backstabbing and ugliness, and there's sensible, who I would call sensible conservatives, who know what it takes to get elected. And then there's conservatives that are sort of incrementally trying to mainstream controversial ideas. So I would say Pierre Poilievre is one. That's maybe he's somewhere in the middle of a sensible conservative and maybe a Trump. And then you've got people who are lunatics, like the Trump types, who are just complete lunatics, and they have no political education whatsoever, no idea how the system works. All they know is they're angry and they want something done right away. And it's tearing at the seams of the federal Conservative Party. Pierre Poilievre is purposefully and willingly running quite an aggressive campaign that has ruffled a lot of feathers. Ed Fast resigned as their finance critic today because he was accused of being biased by pro-Poilievre MPs for saying how ridiculous it was that he wanted to fire the governor of the Bank of Canada. And he was publicly saying, like, he was saying, like, when he went into the caucus meeting, that this is the kind of stuff that hurts our reputation as a party of supposed fiscal responsibility, when we start going out and trying to mainstream ridiculous ideas like, let's just impulsively fire the governor of the Bank of Canada because of some arbitrary thing we made up for fun. Like, and he was, as the party's finance critic, he's like, I need to sound coherent on this, and like, I will not defend this policy. So he basically resigned because of pressure from pro-Poilievre MPs who thought it was making Poilievre look bad. It's like, what? Because he didn't want to jump in line, and so it's just, this is the civil war that's playing out.
And I think it's a civil war that needs to be had, but that the results need to be respected. I do think that at the end of the day, probably there is going to be enough sane Tories to take back leadership. Probably not of the federal party. Probably they'll have to lose a few times before the sane people will take back that party. But certainly, I think provincially, the United Conservatives, there should be enough people there. And I don't say necessarily because there's there's a lot of moderates in the UCP, but I think it's actually because there's more radicals in the UCP and they're more willing to make themselves known, that it's going to scare enough people to tilt the party back into the mainstream. I think the Conservatives nationally are still willing to have the debate in dog whistles and in euphemisms. They're not willing to say exactly what they mean, except for Leslyn Lewis, who goes all the way to say that she's pro-life. I think in the Alberta Conservative leadership debate, we're certainly going to have a lot of people that are unequivocally pro-life. There might be even someone that says that they want to use the notwithstanding clause to re-legalize abortion in Alberta. That honestly could be a real position that we hear in the UCP debate. There could be someone that says that they want to ban gay marriage again. We don't know. I'm almost certain it's going to be there.
Oh, I bet.
It's going to be someone that's going to push it way too far. And it's going to be, I think it can be the triggering event that can actually galvanize a moderate conservative base that just hasn't existed for a long time. Or who knows? Maybe I'm totally wrong, and that can be the policy that galvanizes a dormant ultra-conservative base that takes over that party and drifts it to the real far right. But in that case, I think that's when it becomes a rallying cry for progressives, and it becomes a way for Notley to pave a supermajority. So there is a positive that can come out of it, but we as progressives need to be aware of what's happening. We need to prepare for the worst.
Yep.
And we need to be able to have credible electoral strategies to combat this, to nip this in the bud. We can't have sleeper elections like we're having in Ontario, because these conservative parties, if we let them into office, even if they have a bumbling, seemingly centrist fool like Doug Ford at the top of them, you never know how far they're going to topple over. Jason Kenney tried to pretend to be moderate, and he opened up a Pandora's box that can lead who knows how far. We can't accept this party no matter what face it puts on, and we as progressives need to fight back against it.
Well, we do, and I gotta be honest, I'm one side of me is having a little bit of trouble not breaking out the champagne, because I know that this could easily go the other way and everything could get more terrible than it ever has been, and I do recognize that a big part in Jason Kenney's demise is the fringe far right and the spread of some of the horrible things that the Buffalo shooter had in his manifesto. That's the horrific part. What makes me want to break up the champagne per se is like the fact that somebody like Rachel Notley has an opening to introduce serious progressive policy in a province that before the 2010s it was completely unheard of to be a place that was welcoming for that, and it's turning into that. So I'm hopeful for that. I wish her well, and I'm excited at what she might get done if she gets back in. But again, anything could happen. Elections matter, both leadership in general. And I think, do you have anything else to add? I think we.
No, I'd say that's about it for me. I said I hope this can be a turning point. I hope this can be the absolute nadir of our fortunes from which we can rise up greater than ever before. Let's not let this be the moment of descent into ever further depths. This can be a good moment. This can be a good moment for the province. Let's move forward.
Well said. Let's make it a positive for Alberta. Let's make it a positive for Canada. Let's get back on track with caring for people, with looking after one another.
And now, because the Davos Forum did sponsor this podcast and they're in control of everything, we have to say that this is all part of the Great Reset. We faked COVID and we faked this leadership review, and now we're going to put in a new puppet that's closer to the World Economic Forum that is going to replace all white people in place all white.
And with that, we hope that you enjoyed our bonus episode, particularly the ending, and we hope that you don't turn yourselves away from us, that you keep listening to our craziness, because we appreciate having you along for the ride as we navigate this BS together.
Yeah.
So keep your ear to the ground and take care of yourselves, and we'll see you next time.
Absolutely. See ya.